Hi everyone, it's Miss Wilson here. This is a Blood Brothers revision video focusing on Mrs. Johnstone at the beginning of Act 1. So the scene that we're going to look at today takes place just after the prologue, where we have seen the end of the play foreshadow. We've seen both the brothers die. So this is really an introduction to Mrs. Johnstone. So I'm going to read out this scene. If you don't want to read with me, you can pause the video and skip ahead. If you want to listen as I read, then we're going to begin now. So, music is heard as Mrs. Johnstone turns and walks towards us. She is aged 30, but looks more like 50. Once I had a husband, you know the sort of chap. I met him at a dance and how we came on with the chat. He said my eyes were deep blue pools, my skin as soft as snow. He told me I was sexier than Marilyn Monroe. And we went dancing. Then, of course, I found that I was 6 weeks overdue. We got married at the registry and then we had a do. We all had curly salmon sandwiches, and how the ale did flow. They said the bride was lovelier than Marilyn Monroe. And we went dancing, yes, we went dancing. Then the baby came along. We called him Darren Wayne. Then 3 months on, I found that I was in the club again. And though I still fancied dancing, my husband wouldn't go. With a wife he said was twice the size of Marilyn Monroe. No more dancing, no more dancing. By the time I was 25, I looked like 42. With 7 hungry mouths to feed and 1 more nearly due. Me husband, he'd walked out on me a month or 2 ago. For a girl, they say he looks a bit like Marilyn Monroe. And they go dancing, yes, they go dancing, they go. An irate milkman, the narrator, rushes in to rudely interrupt the song. Listen, love, I'm up to here with hard luck stories. You owe me £3.17 and 4p, and either you pay up today, like now, or I'll be forced to cut off your deliveries. I said, look, next week I'll pay you. Next week. Next week never arrives around here. I'd be a rich man if next week ever came. But look, I start a job next week. I'll have money coming in and I'll be able to pay you. You can't stop the milk. I need the milk. I'm pregnant. Well, don't look at me, love. I might be a milkman, but it's got nothing to do with me. No, you've been told. No money, no milk. The milkman exits. Mrs. Johnstone stands alone, and we hear some of her kids off. Ma'am, the baby's crying. He wants his bottle. Where's the milk? Hey, ma'am, how come I'm on free dinners? All the other kids laugh at me. Hey, mother, I'm starving and there's nothing in. There never bloody well is. Don't swear, I've told you. Mum, I can't sleep. I'm hungry. I'm starving. And me, ma'am, and me. I know it's hard on all you kids. Try and get some sleep. Next week I'll be earning. We'll have loads of things to eat. We'll have ham and jam and spam and roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, Battenberg cake, chicken and chips, corned beef, sausages, treacle tart, mince and spuds, milkshake for the baby. There is a chorus of groaning ecstasy from the kids. Mrs. Johnstone picks up the tune again. When I bring home the dough, we'll live like kings, like bright young things, like Marilyn Monroe, and we'll go dancing. So in this scene, we can really start to see how Mrs. Johnstone is struggling. She's very much a working class mother. So some quick questions for you, and this will really test your knowledge of the play and the context, what you know so far. Number 1, how hard do you think life would have been for single working class mothers in the 1980s? And number 2, what do you think Russell was trying to show about life of the working class through the example of Mrs. Johnstone? So pause the video here and have a go at answering those quick questions. Okay, good. So before we go through the answers to those, I'm just going to go through a little bit of context, a little bit of history of the play and what was going on at the time that this was written. So Russell wrote Blood Brothers in 1981. So this was the period that Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was in power. So Margaret Thatcher is a name that you will have heard when you studied this in class with your teacher. And this is just the beginning. At the moment, we can see that Mrs. Johnstone is clearly struggling. She can't afford to buy her milk. This becomes more important later on when we see the real effect of unemployment later on, especially when Mickey loses his job. But it's important to remember that there were lots of people struggling. There was very high unemployment during this time, particularly in industrial working class areas in northern England, such as Liverpool, which is very important for this play. It's where Russell is from and where the play is set. So you've got Mrs. Johnstone and her family that represent the working classes who were badly affected by the economic downturn, whereas Edward and the Lyons family embody middle classes who thrived in the 1980s. So you've almost got a real divide here between the poor, the working class, and the rich, or the richer middle class. And you can see from that exchange where Mrs. Johnstone can't afford to buy the milk for her family, that she is very much this category, the working class, the struggling. So Liverpool, it's really important that this play is set in Liverpool. So because of its position on the River Mersey, it was a prosperous seaport in the 19th century. So it did really well, the economy was booming. It's a city of many contrasts though. So in the 20th century, contrast of the 19th century when it was prosperous, it was a place of financial depression which led to unemployment and strikes. There was a big gap between the rich and the poor, as you can see, between the working class and the middle class, and that's explored even further in the play when you see Eddie's life compared to Mickey's life. So it's also important in Mrs. Johnstone's song at the beginning that she mentions a figure called Marilyn Monroe. And again, you've probably gone through this in class, but I'll just do a quick recap for you. So she's very famous in the 1950s, a very famous film star, but she died of a drug overdose in 1962 at the age of 36. So she died very young. So when Mrs. Johnstone sings at the beginning, she constantly mentions Marilyn Monroe. So you can see at first she views her as a figure of glamour and wealth, and you can see that she also really aspires to be like her. She's very flattered when people compare her to her, and she sometimes uses her sex appeal to manipulate men in power. But as the musical continues, you can see Mrs. Johnstone comparing herself negatively to Marilyn Monroe. So noting that she has become old and poor, quite unlike her idol. So you can see throughout the play as well, not just in this song at the beginning, that she continually comes back to Marilyn Monroe. And as her family's luck gets worse and worse, Mrs. Johnstone also notices how poor Marilyn Monroe's life turned out as well. So the parallels are really important. They start at the very beginning in her song at the beginning. So they continue late into the play. So when Mickey becomes dependent on antidepressants, that can be compared to Monroe's own addiction struggles. So although she began as an icon of beauty and aspiration, she ends up being yet another tragic example of a terrible life gone awry, much like Mickey. So those parallels don't just start at the beginning, they continue throughout the play. So let's go back to those questions then. How hard do you think life would have been for single working class mothers in the 1980s? Well, we know that life would have been very difficult. It was also expected, you can see this in the Lyons family, that men or husbands would bring in the money. And you can see without a husband, Mrs. Johnstone is really struggling. And what do you think Russell was trying to show about life of the working class through the example of Mrs. Johnstone? So through Mrs. Johnstone, the example of her, life was really difficult. It was a struggle. And a lot of that struggle was down to the class you were, and it was luck. And you can see that further explored in the play when we meet Mrs. Lyons and Eddie. So I have some more questions for you now that I'd like you to have a go at. These are a little bit more in depth, so I'd like you to take a bit longer on these. So 4 questions. Number 1, why do you think that Mrs. Johnstone uses Marilyn Monroe as a comparison throughout her song? So think back to the information that we just learned about Marilyn Monroe and have a think about why her in particular. The verb dancing could be seen as a joyous act to represent freedom and happiness. You know, we dance when we're happy. How is this verb used throughout the song, and how might this symbolise what has happened to Mrs. Johnstone's life? So here you'll have to track that verb dancing in the opening song. Number 3, what does the milkman mean when he says, I'd be a rich man if next week ever came? What does this imply about the area Mrs. Johnstone lives in and the other people who live there? And number 4, explain what type of mother you think Mrs. Johnstone is. And you'll need to find some evidence to support your explanation. So pause the video here, take 10-15 minutes and have a go at those questions. Okay, so I'm going to go through some potential answers, things that I picked up from these questions. So the first one, well, as we looked at in our previous example, we know she was a prominent figure of wealth and glamour throughout the 1950s and early 60s. So, and we know that at first, Mrs. Johnstone is flattered to be compared to her idol and aspires to be like her. But you can see as the song goes on that she compares herself negatively to Marilyn Monroe, thinking that actually she's become really old and poor, quite unlike her. So she continually comes back to her, and as her family's luck gets worse and worse, Mrs. Johnstone also notices how poorly Marilyn Monroe's life turned out as well. So we can also see throughout the play that the links between Marilyn Monroe and the Johnstones are still really important. So you can see, like Mickey becomes addicted to drugs, Marilyn Monroe also died of a drugs overdose. So although she began as an icon of beauty and aspiration, she ends up being yet another tragic example of a life gone terribly awry, much like Mickey. So life has turned out so differently. Although at first she was portrayed as a glamorous film star, it was apparent that she had many issues and went through a publicised downward spiral, resulting in her death from an overdose. So the downward spiral is really important as well throughout the song at the beginning. You can kind of see that Mrs. Johnstone's life started quite similarly, quite glamorous, quite exciting, but after the downward spiral, lots of children, husband leaving, finding herself in financial disaster, she also has a downward spiral. Okay, number 2. So the verb dancing seems to mirror the happy times in Mrs. Johnstone's life. If you track the use of the verb dancing through her song at the beginning, you can see that she's dancing at the beginning when she meets her husband, when she's happy, when she's living that really exciting life, and she's young and carefree. So as the song progresses, the dancing stops when she has her second child, suggesting that times are hard and she is no longer youthful and carefree. She no longer has the energy and desire to dance like she did at the beginning. So eventually, and this is really key here, her husband meets someone else to take dancing. And it's really important to note that the woman he has moved on with is also described as Marilyn Monroe, like Mrs. Johnstone was at the beginning. So the idea of dancing and happiness seem to be linked with being youthful and carefree, something that Mrs. Johnstone's not anymore. So life has been hard for her, and there is no more dancing now. So for this question number 3 here, we're looking at the milkman. And actually, by saying, I'd be a rich man if next week ever came, the milkman could be suggesting that this is something that he hears a lot from the neighbours, and this is the type of area where people can't pay when they should, like Mrs. Johnstone, because they can't afford to. So this could highlight the desperate economical situation and struggles of the working class living in council houses and in poverty-stricken areas. So the character of the milkman could serve to highlight these struggles and show that lack of money is not uncommon. It's not a problem that just affects Mrs. Johnstone, but a huge community of people, a huge class of people. Mrs. Johnstone happens to be the character that we're exploring this idea through. And finally, I asked you to explain what type of mother that you think Mrs. Johnstone is. So there are a lot of potential things you can say here, but I chose in my answer to think that actually, although she's lacking in resources, she is a caring, dedicated mother who desperately wants to provide for her children. And this is really clear when she says, I know it's hard on all you kids, but try and get some sleep. Next week I'll be earning, we'll have loads of things to eat. So this shows that she puts the needs of her children first, and she is desperate to provide for them. She lists all the foods they'll be eating to try and calm them in that sequence where she's getting excited about all the food that they'll eat when she's earning, and the kids are excited as well. So she's also really optimistic and hopeful despite her desperate situation. So times are really hard, but she still maintains hope, and she promises them they'll go dancing. So despite everything, despite not having any money, she envisions happy times ahead for them. She thinks this job will solve the problems that they have at the moment. So there are 2 key quotations that I'd like you to have a go at analysing. Okay, this is the first one. So, but look, I start a job next week, I'll have money coming in and I'll be able to pay you. So what I want you to do is pick a few key words and analyse the language and also the context, writer's intentions. So pause the video here and have a go, and then I'll go through some potential answers with you. Okay, so for this quotation here, looking at language and context and writer's intentions, first thing I thought of was here, but look, look. So repetition there of look. So this could emphasise Mrs. Johnstone's desperation to get the milkman to give her the milk, but also her desperation to provide for her family. So often when we repeat ourselves, it's because we're emphasising something really important. She could also be stuttering because this is really important to her, and also highlights the emotion she must be feeling here. So that language device here, that repetition, could be quite important. So also, I start a job next week, I'll have money coming in and I'll be able to pay you. So it depicts, and depicts is a very fancy way of saying shows, which I like to use in my answers quite a lot. Shows her lack of money because she doesn't have any money now, but she will next week. So this character, Mrs. Johnstone, represents other working class families who cannot afford even basic necessities such as milk due to their circumstances, which is context, looking at the working class, something that was going on at the time the play was written, something that Russell wanted to bring awareness to. Okay, second quote then. When I bring home the dough, we'll live like kings, like bright young things like Marilyn Monroe. So again, I want you to pick out a few keywords and analyse. So pause the video here and have a go. Okay, so there's a few things in this quote that I think are really important. So the first one, this first person pronoun I. Okay, so this highlights Mrs. Johnstone's predicament as a single working class mother. So she doesn't have a husband to provide for the family, so she must do so herself. And this is in contrast to Mrs. Lyons, who does have a husband that brings home the money and she doesn't have to work. So you can see how, by using that pronoun, when I bring home the dough, she has all that responsibility and all that stress. So she's got a predicament as a single working class mother. She's the one who has to provide. Okay, this word here, dough. So this is colloquial, and by colloquial I mean informal term for money. So this is, and you'll notice throughout the play, the working class characters use colloquial language quite a lot, and we'll do a separate video on the use of colloquial language because it's really important. This highlights the differences between working class characters such as Mrs. Johnstone and Mrs. Lyons. These differences become more emphasised later in Act 1, but here this is typical the working class, maybe to do with education, areas that they were growing up in another language that they've heard, but they use a lot of colloquial, informal types of language. So that really highlights their social class. Here, the noun kings, really important. So it has connotations of wealth and luxury, and by connotations, I mean it's what that noun suggests. So wealth and luxury is what we think about when we think about kings. This is a direct contrast to their lives at the moment. So this is a juxtaposition of a language technique here, which highlights their current struggles. And then we've got the link to Marilyn Monroe. So Mrs. Johnstone, as we know, aspires to live like Marilyn, and she was a figure of wealth and glamour. So the reference here at this point in the play shows her high hopes and optimism. So again, going back to the previous TDQ questions, this shows how, despite her circumstances, she's always kind of looking for the positives, and she still remains positive, even when things look dire. Okay, 2 potential exam style questions that we're going to have a go at then. So number 1, how is the theme of poverty explored in this scene? And how is Mrs. Johnstone presented in this scene? So I've had a go at the first one. I'm going to show you my example, and then you're going to have a go at your own. So we're going to use this approach to do, which I always find quite helpful doing these types of exam questions. We're going to do a what, how, why. So the what is the writer, or what the writer is trying to do. So essentially here, you're answering the question. When we say how, we're thinking about how they do it. So quotations, language techniques, and why. So this could link to the overall context of the play and the writer's intention. So why have they chosen to do what they've done, and why have they chosen to use the techniques that they have, or the quotation that they have? So here, this is my what. So what the writer does in response to this question: how was the theme of poverty explored in this scene? The theme of poverty in this scene is explored through the character of Mrs. Johnstone. Mrs. Johnstone represents the working class and is a vehicle for Russell to explore his views about the treatment of the working class in Liverpool in the 1980s. So when I say a vehicle for, I mean it's the driving force, and Mrs. Johnstone is that driving force for Russell to explore his views about the treatment of the working class. By using her as an example, she becomes a vehicle for his beliefs. So this is my how. So now I've talked about the quotation I've picked, and also the technique. So how is the writer doing what I've said they're doing in my what section? So this is made clear during the exchange between Mrs. J and the milkman. She pleads, "But look, I start a job next week. I'll have money coming in and I'll be able to pay you." So look how I've embedded the quote as well. I haven't just said, for example, here's my quote. I've worked it into a sentence. So repetition of the imperative verb look highlights her desperation to get the milk that she needs as she is rambling. Furthermore, the use of the imperative look could show that she is desperate because she is commanding him to listen to her and take pity on her. So when I say imperative or an imperative verb, what I mean is a command. So she is repeating that look, but it's also, she's not asking him to look, she's demanding that he look. She's desperate. So this could show that she's desperate because she's commanding him to listen to her and take pity on her. Throughout this exchange, it's clear that Mrs. J is struggling. She cannot afford the milk and she is desperate to provide for her family. So you can see I've used my quotation, but look, I start a job next week. But I've also analysed the language. I've talked about the imperative verbs and the repetition. So I've really discussed here how the writer has done what I've said they've done. And now my why. You can see I've linked this to the context of what was happening at the time and also the writer's intentions. Perhaps Russell is using the character of Mrs. Johnstone to highlight the difficulties faced by the working class due to the economic downturn of the 20th century. Many families, such as the Johnstones, struggled, whereas middle-class families, such as the Lionses, thrived. This parallels Russell's upbringing in a working-class family in Liverpool. Russell could potentially be trying to highlight the unfairness of the treatment of the working class by creating the character of Mrs. Johnstone and depicting her struggles. So what I've done here in my why section, I've talked about context, I've talked a little bit about what was happening at the time with the working class and the economic downturn, but I've also talked about Russell's intentions, so why he's chosen to do what he's done. Okay, so I would like you to have a go at the second question here. So how is Mrs. Johnstone presented in this scene? And you might want to use the other quotation that I analysed and got you to analyse, or you might want to pick a different one. That's fine too. I'll leave my example here for you so you can see how I've structured this answer. Remember, have a go at following the what, how, why response. So what's the writer done? How have they done it? Why have they done it? And when you've had a go, send your work through to your teacher and your TDQs as well, and they'll have a look at it and give you some feedback. So thank you for watching. I hope you found that helpful. Like I said, if you have any questions about this particular scene, do ask your class teacher and do send some work to them for feedback.